The dense canopy of the Appalachian Mountains loomed overhead, casting long shadows across the forest floor as the sun began its descent. Sarah Matthews, an experienced hiker and wildlife photographer, pushed through the thick underbrush, her camera swinging from her neck. She had come to these remote mountains in search of rare flora, but as twilight approached, she realized with growing unease that she had strayed far from the marked trails. The air grew colder, carrying with it the musty scent of decaying leaves and something else. Something wild and unfamiliar. Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her body. She should have turned back hours ago, but the allure of discovering something new had driven her deeper into the wilderness. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sounds. The rustle of leaves, the crack of twigs, and in the distance, a long, mournful howl that made her blood run cold. Wolves. No, there hadn't been wolves in these parts for over a century. Yet the sound came again, closer this time, followed by another answering call. Sarah's heart raced as she fumbled for her flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing gnarled trees and twisted shadows. She needed to find shelter, and fast. As if in response to her thoughts, the light fell upon the dark outline of what appeared to be an old cabin, half hidden by overgrown vines. Relief flooded through her as she approached, but it was short-lived. The cabin's door hung off its hinges, and as Sarah's light swept across the interior, she saw claw marks gouged deep into the wooden walls. Something had torn this place apart. Another howl pierced the night, so close it made Sarah jump. She whirled around, her light dancing wildly across the trees. For a moment, she thought she saw a pair of gleaming eyes reflecting in the darkness, but they vanished as quickly as they had appeared. With no other options, Sarah stepped into the ruined cabin, her fingers trembling as she tried to wedge the broken door back into place. She retreated to the farthest corner, her back pressed against the rough wood, and waited. The night grew longer and the sounds outside more frenzied. Growls and snarls mixed with the sound of heavy bodies crashing through the underbrush. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. What kind of animals were out there? As the first light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the cabin walls, the noises finally subsided. Sarah, exhausted and terror-stricken, cautiously peered outside. The forest floor was torn up, great furrows dug into the earth as if by massive claws. And there, half hidden in the mud, was a single, massive footprint, too large to be a wolf, shaped almost like a human hand, but distorted, with long, cruel claws at the end of each digit. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. What had she stumbled into? Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would change her life forever. With shaking legs, Sarah stumbled out of the cabin and made her way back towards civilization. After hours of walking, she emerged from the dense forest onto a narrow dirt road. Relief washed over her as she spotted a weathered sign. Welcome to Blackwood Hollow, population 213. The village that greeted her seemed frozen in time, with clapboard houses and old-fashioned storefronts lining the main street. As Sarah walked through, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Curtains twitched in windows, and the few people she saw on the street hurried indoors at her approach. Finally, an elderly man sitting on a porch called out to her. "You shouldn't be here, miss. These woods ain't safe for outsiders." Sarah approached him, desperate for help. "Please, I got lost in the forest. I heard things. What's going on here?" The old man's eyes widened with fear. "You best forget what you saw and get on out of here. Ain't nothing but trouble in these parts." But Sarah couldn't let it go. She recounted her terrifying night in the woods, the howls, the destroyed cabin, and the strange footprint she'd found. With each word, the old man's face grew paler. "You've seen them," he whispered. "The cursed ones. Been plaguing this town for generations. Werewolves, miss. And now that they've caught your scent, they won't stop until they have you." Sarah's mind reeled. Werewolves. It was impossible. Yet the terror in the old man's eyes and the memories of the previous night made her doubt her skepticism. The old man, who introduced himself as Ezra, reluctantly agreed to tell her more. He led her to the local diner, a dingy place with peeling wallpaper and wary-eyed patrons. As they sat in a secluded booth, Ezra recounted the town's dark history. "It started over 100 years ago," he began, his voice low. "A stranger came to town, bringing with him an ancient curse. On the first full moon after his arrival, half the town transformed into savage beasts. They tore through Blackwood Hollow, killing and infecting others. By morning, the town was in ruins, and the curse had spread." Sarah listened, horrified, as Ezra explained how the town had managed to survive. They developed rituals and precautions, locking themselves away during full moons and learning to identify those who carried the curse. But it was a losing battle. Each year, more succumbed to the curse or fled, leaving behind a dwindling population, living in constant fear. As night began to fall, panic set in among the diner's patrons. People rushed to leave, casting fearful glances at the darkening sky. Ezra gripped Sarah's arm. "You need to get out of here, now. The moon will be full tonight." But as they stepped outside, Sarah's heart sank. The road out of town was blocked by a fallen tree, too large to move quickly. Ezra cursed under his breath. "They're cutting us off. They know you're here." With no other choice, Ezra led Sarah to the town's church, a sturdy stone building that had been reinforced over the years to serve as a sanctuary during full moons. As they barricaded themselves inside with a group of terrified townspeople, Sarah could hear the first howls beginning in the distance. The night that followed was one of pure terror. Monstrous shapes threw themselves against the church's walls and doors. Inhuman screams and growls filled the air, punctuated by the terrified whimpers of those inside. Sarah huddled in a corner, her camera clutched to her chest, documenting the nightmare even as she prayed to survive it. As dawn broke, silence fell over Blackwood Hollow. The survivors cautiously emerged to find their town, once again, in ruins. Blood stained the streets, and several buildings had been torn apart. But the true horror came when they found the mangled bodies of those who hadn't made it to safety in time. Sarah's hands shook as she photographed the devastation, her journalist's instinct warring with her desire to flee. She knew she had stumbled upon a story that could shock the world, if only she could live to tell it. In the days that followed, Sarah found herself trapped in Blackwood Hollow. The fallen tree had been only the beginning. Now all roads out of town were blocked or destroyed. Phone lines were down, and any cell phones or radios seemed to malfunction in the area. It was as if the entire town had been cut off from the outside world. Sarah spent her time documenting everything she could, and trying to understand the curse that gripped the town. She learned that not all of those infected transformed completely during the full moon. Some maintained a semblance of humanity, their transformations partial but no less horrifying. These half-turned individuals were often the most dangerous, possessing both human cunning and bestial strength. As the next full moon approached, tension in the town reached a fever pitch. Sarah worked with Ezra and a few other townspeople to fortify the church, but supplies were running low. They all knew that this time, the werewolves would be hunting her specifically. On the night of the full moon, Sarah found herself once again huddled in the church with a dwindling group of survivors. But this time, the assault on their sanctuary was more organized, more relentless. The werewolves seemed to be working together, using tactics that spoke of human intelligence guiding their bestial strength. As the night wore on, the barricades began to fail. Sarah watched in horror as the massive wooden doors splintered under the onslaught. In the chaos that followed, she saw people she had come to know over the past weeks, torn apart or dragged screaming into the night. In desperation, Sarah fled deeper into the church, finding herself in the bell tower. As she climbed, she could hear the sounds of pursuit behind her. At the top, she found herself face to face with a sight that would haunt her forever. A massive werewolf, easily 8 feet tall, with matted gray fur and gleaming yellow eyes, pulled itself up into the bell tower. But it was the creature's face that froze Sarah's blood. Half transformed, she could still recognize the features of Ezra, the old man who had first warned her. "I'm sorry," Ezra's voice growled from the monstrous form. "I tried to fight it, to warn you, but the curse, it's too strong. Run, Sarah, run." With a last terrible howl, Ezra's humanity slipped away entirely, and the beast lunged at her. Sarah, acting on pure instinct, swung the heavy bell with all her might. The sound rang out painfully loud in the confined space, and the werewolf stumbled, disoriented. Taking her chance, Sarah slipped past the creature and fled down the tower stairs. She emerged into a scene of carnage, bodies strewn across the church floor. But she couldn't stop. With werewolves in pursuit, Sarah ran into the night, heading for the deep woods where she hoped she might lose them. The hunt had begun in earnest, and Sarah knew that her only hope for survival lay in outsmarting creatures that were faster, stronger, and now knew the forest far better than she did. Sarah ran through the forest, her lungs burning and her legs aching. Behind her, she could hear the werewolves crashing through the underbrush, their howls growing ever closer. She had no plan, no destination, only the desperate need to survive. As she ran, Sarah's mind raced, trying to piece together everything she had learned about the curse. There had to be a way to end it, to save herself and what remained of Blackwood Hollow. But every legend, every scrap of lore she had uncovered pointed to the same terrible truth. The curse was unbreakable. Just as she felt her strength giving out, Sarah stumbled upon a familiar sight, the old cabin where her nightmare had begun. With no other options, she dove inside, quickly wedging the broken door shut behind her. In the dim light filtering through the cracks, Sarah noticed something she had missed before. Carved into one of the walls was a series of symbols, ancient and weathered. As she traced them with her fingers, a realization struck her. These weren't random markings. They were a map. With trembling hands, Sarah pulled out her camera, comparing the carvings to the photos she had taken of the town and surrounding forest. It all aligned perfectly, showing a path leading deep into the mountains. to a place marked with a symbol she didn't recognize. A crash against the door jolted her back to reality. The werewolves had found her. As claws began to tear through the wood, Sarah made a desperate decision. She kicked out the back wall of the cabin and ran, following the path shown in the carved map. The chase that followed was a blur of terror and exhaustion. Sarah pushed herself beyond her limits, using every trick and scrap of knowledge she had gained to stay ahead of her pursuers. She crossed raging rivers, scaled steep cliffs, and navigated treacherous ravines, always with the sound of howls spurring her onward. Finally, as dawn began to break, Sarah found herself in a hidden valley. At its center stood a circle of standing stones, ancient and covered in moss. The symbol from the map was carved into the largest stone. As she stepped into the circle, a stillness fell over the forest. The werewolves that had been pursuing her stopped at the edge of the clearing, growling but unable to enter. Sarah watched in amazement as they began to transform back into humans with the rising sun. Among them was Ezra, bloodied and weary. "You found it," he gasped. "The source of the curse, the place where it all began." Sarah looked around, realization dawning. This is where the stranger came, the one who brought the curse to Blackwood Hollow. Ezra nodded. Legend says he was a traveler from distant lands, seeking to rid himself of the werewolf's curse. He performed a ritual here, thinking to transfer the curse to the land itself. But instead he only spread it, binding it to the valley and all who dwell here. As Ezra spoke, Sarah felt a change coming over her. The events of the past weeks, the terror, the full moons, the bites and scratches she had sustained, it all culminated in this moment. She could feel the curse taking hold, threatening to transform her as it had so many others. But standing in the stone circle, Sarah also felt a connection to the land, to the curse itself. She understood now why she had been drawn here, why she alone had been able to find this place. The curse wasn't meant to be broken. It was meant to be controlled. With this knowledge came a terrible choice. Sarah could leave, try to return to her old life, knowing that the curse would eventually consume her. Or she could stay, learning to control the curse and using her strength to protect what remained of Blackwood Hollow. As the sun rose fully, Sarah made her decision. She would stay, becoming the guardian of this cursed land. She would use her skills, her knowledge, and her newfound power to find a balance between the human and werewolf worlds. The curse would continue, an endless cycle of full moons and transformations. But under Sarah's guidance, perhaps Blackwood Hollow could find a way to survive, to coexist with the darkness that dwelt in the Appalachian Mountains. As Sarah turned to face Ezra and the others, her eyes glowed with a new, otherworldly light. The most terrifying encounter of her life had led her to a destiny she could never have imagined. The curse was never-ending, but with it came the power to protect, to endure, and perhaps one day to thrive. The tale of the werewolves in the Appalachian Mountains would continue, with Sarah at its heart, a story of terror, survival, and the blurred line between humanity and the beasts that lurk in the shadows of the ancient forests.